Hello and welcome to the Antifada, where unrest is best. I'm Jamie Peck.
I'm Sean KB.
And AP Andy is still somewhere. We're not sure. He's not in Cuba anymore. He's gone off to an undisclosed location. I think he might have got a tip on where the best dumpster treats are located in the country. So
perhaps somewhere in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, so he's still off on his little Rumspringa journey.
That's right.
But
every Mapache has to go on a Rumspringa, and he may or may not come back, depending on what he finds in the outside world.
Indeed. Maybe he'll come back with a congresswoman girlfriend. Who knows? So our guest today is Samuel Stein. He is a PhD candidate at the CUNY, that is City University of New York, Earth Sciences Department, and author of the book Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State, out now on Verso Books.
Thank you very much.
Now, I love how you come out of the CUNY Earth Sciences Department. It sounds so STEMmy. So what is it? Science, technology, engineering, and math?
That's right. That's what I'm all about.
Right. Yeah. But yet your book is not all like algorithms, and it's not about like material science. Tell us a little bit about this department and why you seem like a STEM guy, but you're not.
I think the book is pure science, I'd say.
The science of...
The
immortal science
of truth. That's right. I studied geography, and they put us in the Earth and Environmental Sciences department over there at the Graduate Center, where in theory we have physical scientists looking at the Earth and the volcanoes and the ocean and stuff, and then we have human geographers studying the politics of space.
And I have some experience because I had taken some classes there way back in the day under a guy named David Harvey. And it seems like that department is a hotbed of communist infiltration. There's just a bunch of pinkos up in there. Marxist geography is center, I think, in the entire world, would you say?
I would say, pink to red.
Pink to red.
The pinks are on the right.
Nice.
That's where we like to keep them.
Speaking of Marxist geography, do you know the other Jamie Peck?
Oh, I've read him many times.
Because we would really like to have him on sometime. I think it would be really cute.
That's
all right.
That's
other
a joke.
Jamie Peck, if you're listening right now, come on the Antifada.
That's great. You said it so we didn't have to.
Jamie Peck, go on the Antifada.
We've been joking about that for a long time. We really will make that happen, though.
He's a smart guy. He's nice.
He is a Marxist geographer. Right?
He is a Marxist geographer. I believe he's in Vancouver.
Right, okay.
Studies a lot of the same stuff as me, but more rigorously.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, don't sell yourself short. We're going to get pretty rigorous on this episode, but not so rigorous that you can't follow.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can never have too many Marxist geographers, so perhaps we'll do an episode with him someday. It's going to be so cute.
Maybe we could do a collective pod or something.
It's funny, like our internet presences used to be very easy to tell apart when I was like a suicide girl / lady blogger / music journalist, and he was a Marxist geographer. But now that I've kind of pivoted to writing more about politics,
right,
and using the terms such as neoliberalism, our paths are starting to converge.
Has he shifted toward your old world at all?
Have you been checking out any of the male glamour websites out there to see if he might have tattoos and piercings? And
I have not.
He's very handsome.
Wow.
He's a silver fox.
There you go.
Well, maybe I'll have to do a little research after the show.
See, in a different world, you could have married Jamie Peck, which I don't think is an incest, even though you have the same name. You know, you could have had a silver fox Marxist geographer husband with the exact same name as you, which wouldn't be creepy at all.
Don't give me any ideas, babe.
Mr. and Mrs. Jamie Peck.
Jamie's Peck.
Jamie's Peck.
Yeah. It's like attorneys general.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
There is another Sam Stein who writes about politics.
I know.
Yeah.
Have you ever fought him?
I haven't. I was very proud of myself the day that he figured out I existed.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Has Jamie Peck figured out if Jamie Peck exists?
He follows me on Twitter, so yes.
Hell
Right.
yeah. Nice.
We follow one another.
Yeah.
That you should slide into his DMs.
I might just do that.
Not in like a Russell Brand sexual way,
No.
but in like a Jamie Peck on Antifada sort of thing.
Yeah, it'll be very professional.
Indeed. So our history with Samuel Stein, author of this amazing book that we're about to talk about right now, goes back some years. We have some mutual friends in common. It was 2 years. Sam just reminded me that we first encountered one another at the last Historical Materialism Conference in New York City. Sam, you were on a panel talking about very similar things to what we're talking about today. Is that right?
That's right. That was the first time I ever shared any piece of the book in public.
Well, sharing is caring, and unfortunately, we did miss a whole bunch of it. But I heard it was great. It's great.
Thank you.
It's great.
And this was 2 years ago. This wasn't just now.
No,
Because
right.
we just had a HM.
Yeah, like 2 weeks ago. This was 2 years ago.
years
But the context of that was really interesting and kind of funny in retrospect, because here you are sitting in the studios of the Antifada. By that I
Beautiful
mean
studios.
No, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say by that I mean the studios of Sam Cedar, which we have appropriated for our own purposes. But 2 years ago, our mutual friend Asher had asked me for the Verso Books podcast that they have to actually interview you. I think it was some anniversary of one of my favorite books. I'm sure I know an inspirational book for you, which was Bob Fitch's Assassination of New York. And at that time, I think I spoke with you about it there, but part of why it never happened is because 2 years ago I was like, I can't do an interview like with a microphone on a radio. How the hell am I going to do that? And here we are with a podcast, and here you are. So I think, Sam, we're making up for lost time.
It's finally happening.
It's all happening, folks. It's fucking beautiful. So
Dreams really do come true.
and you now have a book to plug. It's not
I
just
do.
your first offering, but you also have a book out from Verso and Jacobin. So that's what's up.
Yeah,
we
thanks
all
for having me.
we all rise together.
Indeed.
So before we get into the meat of the episode, we try to get to know all our guests a little bit on a personal level. So how did you get into city planning in the first place, and also socialism?
Socialism long before city planning. I don't know. I grew up in a household that was certainly comfortable with socialism, whether or not it was itself socialist household. I had kind of like a total ideological break when I was about 15, and that started in anarchism and then moved towards gradually more comfort with the state over time, which eventually put me into city planning, where you're like very exposed to anarchist ideas but not anarchist practice at all.
Yeah, you mentioned actually a part towards the end of your book about how many anarchists there are in that particular profession.
So many.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think of city planning and anarchism as going hand in hand.
What's the connection there?
So there's a few connections. One is the ideological roots of city planning in certain anarchist ideas about space and about the abolition of city and country and creating sort of utopian realities in the present. And so people like Kropotkin and Recluse, and they sort of inspire some of the early urban planners, the Garden City movement coming out of the UK. And so the very roots of urban planning are actually in anarchist philosophy. But then you've got this sort of cultural side also, where there's a lot of anarchists who like critical mass and skateboarding and stuff like that. Then they start getting into anti-car politics, and then like, well, maybe I'll work for the Department of Transportation and plan bike paths and
Fucking sellouts.
I guess that's the problem when you don't have an underlying Marxist critique.
Well, I was going to say, I believe it was in the 50s and 60s, there started to be a more and more ruthless Marxist critique. I'm thinking of Henri Lefebvre, especially, and then, of course, the Situationists as well. And then David Harvey in the 70s and 80s really turns this analytical project into something quite serious that you're now involved in.
Yeah, and I see that as kind of the roots of the modern left geography and urban planning tradition, for sure. I mean, I'm not mad at anarchists who go into city planning. Like, I'm happy to have them there. I think there can be sometimes like a real intensive focus on the evils of the car and parking, to putting aside everything else.
I'm picturing like Fred Armisen's bike character from
Yes.
Portlandia, like
Yes.
bike, got a
Bicycle rights.
bike come through.
Yeah, exactly. He's a model urban planner for the city of Portland.
Nice.
Hell yeah.
He probably is.
Well, Portland is suffering the blight of, not blight, but gentrification. So that's that's part of the subtitle to your book, and it's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. But before we jump into the meat of things, this is the part of the Antifada where we say, folks, we rely on your support. If you would like some bonus content, access to our Discord server, potential goodies that we're going to have in the future beyond the sticker and propaganda packs that we sent out, we're working on some new ones of those. Do go to www.patreon.com/theantifada to give your money to those devils over there at that website, most of which still comes to us. We appreciate your support. And if you want to subscribe, we'll love you forever.
Good job, babe.
Thanks. I can plug stuff too.
Good job. I also want to thank everyone who came out on Friday to see me, as well as Jake Flores, Katie Halper, Matt Taibbi, and Leslie and Jack from Struggle Session at Littlefield in Brooklyn. It was a lot of fun. It was cool to meet some of our listeners who came out to the show, and it was just nice to see everyone.
Yeah, and we also ran into some old friends like T from Champagne Sharks. It was good to see him. We met for the first time a guy who goes by Chad Vigorous, Pretty Bad Lefty on Twitter, and turns out he's cool and smart as fuck, and we will probably end up having him on the show soon. We had a really good time. Great to see everybody. Great hanging out. And stay tuned for our live show coming up later this summer. So, Sam, your book gives a nice, concise history of the housing question over the last several hundred years of capitalism. We could do, I think, an entire episode on that history. Of course, I have my History as a Weapon series, and maybe you and I will be working in the future on that. But, we're not gonna do the entire thing. We're not gonna do 300 years because, as Engels said as early as 1872, capitalism cannot solve the housing question. It can only move the problem around. So let's begin this episode by outlining for our audience kind of how we got to the current conditions that we all face. So if we assume that all of our listeners are born between about 1970, let's say, and about the year 2000, sorry if you're older than that or younger than that, but that's probably the general spectrum. All of us, and ourselves included, have experienced similar circumstances in our lifetimes around housing, right? So rural areas that are hollowed out and underserviced, urban areas which are increasingly gentrified but have been where most of the decent paying jobs are, and the suburbs, which at one point in time in the post-war period represented this American dream of home ownership, right? Those suburbs are sometimes stable still to this day, but we've seen a huge rise in the last decade of crime, addiction, especially opiate addiction, and of course with the crash 10 years ago, foreclosure crisis, right? So kind of bring us over the last 40, 50 years, how we got to this current state of the housing market, the fire sector dominance, and all that good stuff.
Wow.
You have 3 minutes. No, go ahead and just a basic outline of how things changed from that Fordist era, into the period of today.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at that period of change. We can talk about neoliberalism, and we can talk about the capital strikes that happened in the mid-1970s. One way that I found useful to think about the question of gentrification and the spatial politics of it all was to think about deindustrialization as part of the genesis of gentrification, to think about urban space and urban capitalist politics as defined by a certain kind of conflict within the capitalist class between industrial capitalists and real estate capitalists. And of course, there were different kinds of capital as well, but those two were big blocks that both had demands on the state, but they were slightly different. And so both of them had the same dynamic in which they required things of the state, but they also didn't want the state to have too much power. So they needed the state to provide all sorts of infrastructure, transportation, water systems, electricity, everything else. But they didn't want to give the state actual control over the things that made them profitable entities. So they've got these demands of the state, but they're limited. Within those demands, industrial capital and real estate capital are asking for a different set of things. Industrial capital is making stuff on land, and as such, they want the land to be cheap, right? The land is a cost factor. Same for the buildings, like the factories. They want their workers' housing to be cheap, not because they're cool people, but because they want to pay them less. And if their workers are putting all this money into housing, they're going to start demanding higher wages.
Right, because the way they make a profit is from paying people to make things for them, like literal physical things in the world. And they sell those things and take the profit off the top of that. They're not using the buildings themselves to make a profit.
Yeah, exactly. And it's assumed that the building's value goes down over time, not up over time.
The organic composition of capital.
There we go. Yeah. So that's what industrial capital is demanding from the state. They don't want environmental regulation, for example, because they want to be able to do whatever they want to the land, wherever they want. Real estate capital, on the other hand, tends to like some of those environmental regulations because it cleans up space that they can then use for development. They hate anything that makes land values depressed or housing costs restricted because that's how they make all their profit. So there's this internal conflict within the capitalist class. And workers, on the other hand, are demanding all sorts of other things from the state. And so it was planners' job to be mediating between these different interests of capital on the one hand and labor on the other. And that's how we see the development of urban planning in the late 19th and early 20th century. Of course, by the period that you're talking about, 1970 to the present, we're seeing what we call deindustrialization, but of course really isn't that. It's just the spatial relocation of production and automation. But it means a lot of manufacturing moving out of the center of the city. So here we are right now in a former industrial building converted into residential condos or rentals or something. Yeah. That's pretty common during this period. Manufacturing capital first goes to the immediate exurbs, then to the south, then out of the country altogether. And so that leaves all these vacuums. It leaves a spatial vacuum. So there's all this space that can then be turned over to other more profitable uses. There's an economic vacuum. There's all these people who used to work in manufacturing in the city. They're not working there anymore. New York City lost 750,000 manufacturing jobs between 1950 and 1990. And then you've got this political vacuum. Industrial capital is no longer making all these very strong demands on the state for cheap land and cheap housing. And so the finance, insurance, real estate sector really expands its political power and dominates the demands of the state through urban planning.
And to talk about that, those fractions of capital, when you had that industrial capital that was in the driver's seat in, say, a place like New York City or Cleveland or elsewhere, they also had, let's say, not allies, you'd call allies in the working class and the trade unions, to the extent that they too wanted cheap subsidized housing. They too wanted infrastructure investments because the labor unions and the working classes in those, in the city had a lot of strength and a lot of bargaining power. And to the extent that their interests lined up with that industrial capital, the two could have a contradictory, but also at the same time kind of mutually beneficial relationship around housing and development, right?
Yeah, and that kind of politics is then foreclosed when industrial capital stops being such a powerful force. And we shouldn't think back to that as this awesome period of interclass friendship or anything, but it was a period with more political possibilities than we have right now, where it seems like everything good that we want in our life is supposed to be done through means that make land more valuable, like things that are good for the real estate industry.
And if we get back to the Bob Fitch book, Assassination of New York, he's talking about the Regional Plan Association and other groups that represent real estate and finance capital to a large extent, which had plans going all the way back to the teens and 20s in order to eliminate, say, the docks surrounding Manhattan, to eliminate the dirty industries that had been in that area. Not out of it wasn't a conspiracy. It was a plan that was, again, in the interest of, I forget the statistics, it's something like office space, for example, was worth like 8 or 10 times more per foot than industrial space was. Right. So they were this direct influence of that FIRE sector on how the built environment of the city was to progress.
Yeah, so it's important to say that deindustrialization or industrial restructuring or whatever we want to call it, it happened for a lot of reasons, some of which were internal to the decisions of industrial capitalists, and some of which were external and were pushed by the state at the behest of groups like the Regional Plan Association. And so part of the genius of that book, The Assassination of New York, is he's talking about, well, why did this deindustrialization happen? And he shows the plans that the city pushed to make it happen. Then he shows the nonprofit and experts who were telling the city what to do. And then he finds the landowners who were funding the nonprofits.
Right.
And so he traces it back to, the Rockefellers are his kind of primary case, but all these landowning families that were telling the experts what their expert opinion should be, and then they would present it to the city as this sort of politically neutral idea about good city form, that we shouldn't have all these uses all jumbled on top of each other. And there's some quote in the 1929 Regional Plan Association document about how it jumbles the senses, that we should have coffee roasting in the same area that we have our financial sector. And so we should split it up and order it out. And it becomes that language of, well, we're just rationalizing the city. But of course, the real rationalization is office space makes a lot more money than industrial space.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to ask about these philanthropic outfits in a minute, but I think I just want to go over to make sure that all of our viewers understand the differences between...
You're not on the Majority Report, listeners.
Okay.
Unless we're live streaming this.
Wait, what?
No, you said viewers, not listeners.
Did I?
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
Jesus
fine.
Christ. Whatever. I just want to go over so people understand the difference between how profit is generated in an industrial business versus how it's generated in a real estate business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you gave a really good summary of how it's generated in an industrial business, which is capitalists own the means of production. They employ workers to make a thing. They pay the workers a fraction of the value that they produce, and then they sell the product on the market to consumers. Real estate capital is trying to sell either the land itself or a thing that they build on the land, be it a single family home or a multifamily apartment building or an office building or whatever. And there's a quote in the book from David Harvey where he says something like, real estate is based on fictitious value of expected future profits. So you're always buying a thing to sell it for more later, which is the case in any kind of capitalist industry, except here we're talking about the most fundamental thing, which is land and space.
And housing us in a lot of cases.
And housing more and more. So in like the history of capitalism, land has always been a key holder of wealth. But in this particular moment, it's urban housing that's really the point of concentration of global capital.
Yeah, that's so scary. Like when I'm trying to explain to people why it's bad to have everything be commodified on the market, or like explaining the difference between use value and exchange value, housing is a really good example because housing, we all need it, right? Like we all understand this is a thing that humans created for ourselves because we need shelter.
Right.
We need a place to live. We've been doing this since the dawn of time. But under capitalism, this thing that we created for its use value becomes its exchange value on the market. And that leads to stuff like, giant buildings sitting totally empty because like rich people are just parking their capital there and using it as an investment while people are homeless, like right outside on the street. And that's like a very visceral feeling for most people, I think. It is.
And we're at a moment of record homelessness at a time where it's also extremely profitable to buy and warehouse property. So there are more vacant luxury apartment buildings in New York City than there are homeless people. And yet we have a record number of homeless people.
God. So I wanted to ask you why real estate has become so profitable and so central to the economy at this particular point in time.
I think there's a lot of reasons. I wish I had one that was like really clear. So instead, I think I often think like this. There's a bunch of explanations which in some ways are all the same thing, but I can only think of it in the plural. So one way of thinking about it is we had this crisis of falling rates of profit in industries that in some ways created the capitalist crisis of the early 70s that was the momentum for the neoliberal turn. So in a lot of industries, there was a falling rate of profit. When that happens, a lot of capital then moves into hard assets like land, which is seen as more profitable and safer in the long term. Land and real estate is also really undertaxed in the United States, and so it makes sense as a speculative venture. We also had things like the financial deregulation that occurred from the 1970s on really escalated in the 80s and 90s, and it was particularly targeted at housing. So housing became a thing that you could, banks could take the mortgages that they had loaned out to a whole bunch of people and turn them into derivatives, which they could then sell little shares of all over the world. That's how we got the 2008 financial crisis.
I was going to say, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, right. We'll find
Hey,
out.
all my trenches are good. I got tons of trenches still.
Yeah. So that created the opportunity for a whole bunch of money to move into real estate. We had quantitative easing more recently, which was that program where basically the Federal Reserve bought out from the Treasury a whole bunch of toxic assets from the banks. That was a crucial part of the bank bailout. That was the mechanism, but the effect of it was just to create huge amounts of capital out of thin air for the banks to immediately use. And so they got all this money, and the first thing that you could put it in for a fast return was real estate, and specifically luxury real estate.
And this takes us a little far afield from urban planning itself, but in my mind, all of these contradictions that you're talking about and all these movements of capital and this kind of shift in the entire global political economy over the last 40, 50 years has had immense political repercussions. And I'm thinking specifically of, let's say the 1980s and the farm crisis. We had Farm Aid, which was a concert by, I think it was Bob Geldof, right? And they were trying to raise money for all the farmers who were losing their land out west. There was a real crisis in farm ownership. If you go to rural parts of this country right now and you look, there is not just disinvestment, but complete just obliteration of all the social bonds and all of the social services and any potential to have a job outside of some service job somewhere. And then again, like the suburban issue as well that we were talking about. It seems like the way that capital has been moving and the way that the economy is structured, you have a small number of cities, New York City, San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, I don't know if you throw some more out, Chicago, then London, of course, and then other great cosmopolitan cities, which are flowing with jobs, but at the same time too expensive to live in, and then giant tracts of land across the United States and elsewhere that people cannot find jobs, and things have deteriorated.
Right, and in those places, the eviction rates are the highest. So eviction rates are high in gentrifying cities, but they're even worse in hyper-disinvested spaces. And I think the phenomenon that you're talking about, the words that we geographers tend to use is geographically uneven development, that capital tends to sort places out into spaces of hyper-investment and hyper-disinvestment, and that's happening to a more and more extreme extent. And I think you can see it on this macro scale, where we have large amounts of disinvestment and relatively small pockets of investment. But that's where, as you say, a lot of the jobs are. There's a ton of money. There's a lot of people living there. So we've got that dynamic. But then even within any given place, you're going to see neighborhoods that are hyper-invested and neighborhoods that are hyper-disinvested. Even within one neighborhood, it's going to be by the block. And then sometimes within one apartment building, you've got apartments that have been fixed up and selling for a whole lot of money, and then others that are usually intentionally allowed to fall apart so that it creates the next opportunity for reinvestment.
Especially those rent-controlled ones, right?
I definitely lived in one of those in college, but we'll get to those kinds of stories in the bonus.
That's right. We're all going to tell some horror stories from our living in New York City for all these years. But no, it's interesting, and there was a very dark fact in your book, which is that since the crisis that you talked about that was based on mortgage-backed securities, or at least reflected itself in this financial crash that was tied to housing in the United States and elsewhere, subsequent to that, we've seen hedge funds and large investing institutions start to buy up all sorts of rental properties all over the country.
Right.
Even, I think you said in your book, trailer parks now, where the price of living on a in a trailer on a lot somewhere is becoming more than even those people can bear, because it seems like capital after that crisis has doubled down on this fire sector investment to the detriment of, I think, anybody who has to, survive and have a house to live in and shelter.
Yeah, and it's the same private equity, or as we call them in the tenant movement, predatory equity investors who are investing in rent-stabilized properties, and they're putting in money or they're taking out huge amounts of debt to buy up these properties. There's no way that the rent rolls could support that level of debt. So it's built into the system that they have to raise the rents and evict people. The same predatory equity investors are going to these trailer parks in upstate New York and other places. It's Sam Zell. It's Warren Buffett, every liberal's friend.
Right.
Who's
the
buying,
nice capitalist.
The nice capitalist is buying up these trailer parks because they've identified a rent gap, a difference between the rents that are currently being taken out of this property and what could be extracted if some reinvestment was made or if some legal change was made.
Yeah, this strikes me as one of the incredibly destabilizing features of capitalism, right? Because if we had some kind of sane planning, like say on the level of the country, although, ultimately we want a one world government because we are globalists. But yeah, you could say, let's invest equally everywhere in the country. That way everyone can get something. The way that these like real estate speculators make money, for instance, is that there are areas of extreme wealth and there are areas of extreme poverty, and whichever one you're dealing with, you can make money on it.
Exactly.
And then tying it back to your book, too, there are municipal and state policies, and even federal to an extent, too, that exacerbate this. Because you talk about the provision of services like parks and transportation in neighborhoods not being essentially about making them more livable for the people, but to continue this rise in property values and speculation, right? So there's the planning aspect of it, right?
Yeah, and with that, sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes the plan is let's juice the hell out of these land values and rise them up, and then we'll get more property taxes out of it, and we'll use that on social services or whatever. So sometimes that's the plan, and sometimes it's not. It's actually planners just trying to make neighborhoods nice, but without control over the land. The result of a nice new neighborhood is it's going to be more expensive. And so we've got this spoils system where whoever owns the land gets to keep the accrued value that the state creates.
Which is a social investment, but it's being privatized, essentially.
It seems like public risk for private profit. Am I wrong?
That sounds familiar, yeah.
So there's all sorts of solutions out there for this that are thrown around in the public sphere. We've all heard of the NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard people. And they're very instrumental in stopping things like high-speed rail and other sorts of big investments like that, but also even upzoning a place like San Francisco or Seattle, where you have a lot of, one-family, two-family homes in areas that you could potentially have a 20-story apartment building and fit a lot more people in. So we know about the NIMBYs, but another big movement that's come up to try to address this is the YIMBYs, right? The yes in my backyards. Those folks say it is a supply and demand issue, right? You don't have enough housing in Austin. You don't have enough housing in Berlin. You don't have enough housing, so let's just build up high. So let's handicap some of those arguments for YIMBYism, right? Why doesn't supply and demand have the same sort of price regulation function for housing as it does for other commodities in general?
All right. Let me say this first. And I've been thinking about this because, it's not surprising that it's some of the YIMBYs who have been giving me the most critiques of the book. So the one thing I want to say up front is at least the YIMBY movement recognizes that the status quo sucks, right? They recognize that the system is not working, and they have a set of solutions. And their set of solutions, as you said, is basically to build more. And we can also break up the YIMBYs into the ones who align themselves with the ideological right and the ones who align themselves with the ideological left, and the ones who seem to say more building of anything anywhere is the solution versus ones who are more careful than that. There's a mix of opinions about rent control, etc. I guess I'm trying in the book to turn the gaze toward the surplus of investment in real estate as a root, if not the root, of the problem, rather than the deficit of housing quantity. Right. And so part of that has to do with the problem that we've seen in New York, where if you build up, it doesn't necessarily result in lower land values. So there are people in New York who say, from this YIMBY perspective, we haven't built enough. But in the recent years, anyway, we have built more apartments than the number of people moving in would demand. So those numbers do actually work out, except we've had a rise in almost the same amount of vacancies. And they're not like accidental vacancies where the landlord can't sell. They're purposeful vacancies of the type you were talking about before, Jamie, where it's profitable to buy and hold on to these apartments. Some of them get used as Airbnbs. Some of them are purely speculative ventures to be bought, unoccupied, and then sold again. So until we fix the problem of speculation, the supply thing doesn't even create new homes. It just creates new investment opportunities.
Yeah, and a follow-up to that, too, as you mentioned in your book, that because how much it costs to build a place like New York City or London or San Francisco, invariably when there is new development, it's on the top end, the high end of the market. And okay, so presumably what people argue is that, well, that will siphon off, some of the more wealthy renters, let's say, or investors in housing, and they will live in the luxury buildings, which will open up the older tenements to poorer people.
Yeah, it'll create less competition for the middle income housing, right?
Yeah, right. There's a supply and demand argument. However, neighborhoods aren't like that. If you're in Brownsville or East New York, and all of a sudden you build a giant luxury high rise, it is going to have an effect on the prices of everything around that area and start to price out other people as it becomes a quote unquote more desirable place to live. Right.
And often the YIMBY arguments get made at a very large geographical scale, which then misses the difference between a Brownsville and an Upper East Side. And so I do talk in the book about flipping some of the zoning protections that currently protect fairly wealthy, mostly white neighborhoods in places like the outskirts of New York that are still fairly transit rich, and some right in the middle of Manhattan that are not as dense as the rest of the borough. They've got all these special protections. Then you've got the encouragement of new development, which, like you said, is going to be luxury unless regulations make it otherwise, in poorer areas. And so if we flip that around, you would have at least like a different dynamic. You're saying if you build that luxury building in the middle of Brownsville, of course it's going to raise the neighborhood rents. But what happens if you build that building in Forest Hills?
Right.
The rents are already quite high there.
Yes.
And if you had some affordability in that building, that would be a net increase in affordable housing. If you do the same thing on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx, you're losing affordable housing, replacing it with luxury housing, and saying, oh, look, we put some affordable apartments in there too.
And for folks who aren't from New York, Forest Hills
there are
is
people
traditionally...
who aren't from New York?
Yeah, believe it or not, they exist. They're out there. Most of our listeners aren't. But Forest Hills is a traditionally middle-class to upper-middle-class neighborhood that is... zoned rather sparsely compared to the rest of the city. So you're saying that by putting affordable housing there, as opposed to in a poorer community, you're actually increasing the mix of different incomes within that, as opposed to simply only rezoning those areas where people are poor anyways.
Yeah, we're kind of doing this like backwards integration thing, where most city planning is geared towards integrating the city by moving richer white people into poorer and people of color neighborhoods. Whereas what we need to be doing is creating opportunities for people to live in these segregated white spaces and breaking those up, if anything. And that's really not what most cities are doing. So in New York, we've got this program of inclusionary zoning, which means we raise the amount that you're allowed to build, and we say some portion of that has to be affordable. But we're really only doing that in neighborhoods that are currently affordable or are starting to gentrify. We're completely leaving out the wealthy, protected neighborhoods where a program like that might actually make some sense.
Right.
But those are politically powerful neighborhoods that are able to say, you know what, we've got what we want, what we need from the city. We don't really want any of this new housing, whether it's affordable or not.
Yeah, and the Upper East Side and Upper West Side won't even let like a waste transfer center or any other sort of important critical infrastructure, let alone like cheaper housing or homeless shelters in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I actually recently, some local business owners were, I feel like I'm loud. Local business owners were making a big stink because they were trying to open up a men's shelter, I believe, somewhere in Bushwick. And they were like, oh, why weren't we consulted? We need more input on this. But like you can kind of read between the lines in that and say, maybe they just don't want a men's shelter on the same block as their business.
Right. And so what you end up having is a right of refusal for wealthy people and for businesses, whereas you don't have a right of refusal for working class communities that say, hell no, we don't want this new luxury building in our neighborhood. This isn't good for us. Right.
Yeah, like I've often heard these programs described as like a Trojan horse for gentrification. Because, yeah, exactly what you said. You're still getting to build the luxury buildings in a neighborhood. And they're like, oh, well, people need affordable housing. But the housing in that neighborhood is already somewhat affordable and becomes less so with the presence of these big developments.
Right. And in 10, 20 years, they'll be counting the number of affordable units that were created. They won't count the number that were destroyed in the process.
So these processes have happened under both really openly craven representatives of capital like Mayor Bloomberg, as
Come
well
on, people.
as well as ostensible progressives like Bill de Blasio.
I'm Bill de Blasio. I'm going to do more 421A, and it's going to be great.
So
we give him an Obama voice, sorry.
Yeah, assuming that folks like de Blasio are operating in some kind of good faith, even if they're also doing bad neoliberal policies, what are the constraints on politicians in this arena, and what's the argument that they would make in favor of this kind of policy benefiting regular working class people?
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, the constraints are important to understand, or else we won't understand why we haven't already won.
Right.
So one way of understanding the constraints that are on cities and mayors and planners is to think about this opposite tendencies that have happened under neoliberalism of devolution and centralization. So on the one hand, we have devolution, which is pushing down responsibility for all sorts of things, from higher levels of government to lower levels of government, from the federal to the state, from the state to the local. And so local governments become responsible for more and more and more and more, and they have limited means to deal with those problems. For example, the federal government used to pay for a lot more of public housing than it does now, used to pay for a lot more of transit operations than it does now. Those things are now cut. Cities have to find ways to pay for them. The one thing that they do have total control over is land use, zoning, planning, development, which means that becomes the hammer by which they bang every nail. I don't know if I got that metaphor right.
Close enough.
So you got that. But then at the same time, you have centralization of control, where the federal government puts restrictions on what cities can do, and states even more so put restrictions on what cities can do. So the federal government, for example, says no new public housing. If you have a net increase in your public housing, we're not going to pay for it. The state governments, many of them say you can't have rent control at all. And in New York City, we had our rent control laws taken away from the local control and brought to state control in the 1970s. And so the state puts all these limitations on how cities can address the problem. So you've got cities being more responsible for all these things, but not having some of the best tools to address them. So that's one set of constraints that got us here. In terms of how these politicians justify it, well, if you were Michael Bloomberg or that kind of conservative, technocratic, we love the market kind of mayor, you say, we are aiming to produce, or we already are, a luxury city. That was Bloomberg's line. This New York City is a luxury product. It's not like, a Walmart. It's a sharper image or something. It's going to be expensive, and so we will attract the best and the brightest, by which he means the richest and the most oligarchic, to come and buy, and we will be, and again, this is his phrase, the world's second home.
Oof.
Yeah.
No vacancy, Bloomberg.
Wow. Wow. I'm just hearing the sharpening of guillotines in my mind.
Seriously. Well, he got three terms out of it.
He
so
did.
Whatever he said, it worked.
He almost lost the third time, too.
Yeah. We actually mentioned quickly the Christine Quinn shit on the Katie Halper episode, how she pulled the strings for him and ended up getting screwed by de Blasio in the end. But de Blasio comes in, right? And so, how come he can't do it? What's going on there?
Right. So de Blasio comes in saying, I'm a liberal, maybe he says progressive, and everything I do is going to be all about inequality. Everything, whether it's, his actually good stuff about raising municipal wages, universal pre-K, or his horrendous stuff about bringing in Bill Bratton as the police commissioner or some of his housing and zoning policies, it all gets framed as a big crusade against inequality. So he has this rhetorical device that whatever it is, it's aimed at reducing inequality. A lot of what he does around housing, around zoning, around planning mirrors what Bloomberg did, but with this completely different rhetoric attached to it. So it still tends to increase development capacity in gentrifying neighborhoods and in places that are majority people of color. And it still tends to use luxury development as either the solution to any set of problems or at least a crucial part of how we solve them. And that includes building more affordable housing, which is absurd because if you use luxury development, you're making the city more expensive in order to make it cheaper. And it is de Blasio's main way of dealing with the crisis in public housing is by creating more luxury housing, which is something Bloomberg tried to do but failed.
He tried to build luxury housing on the parking lots of public housing in the city. That was Bloomberg, right?
Bloomberg tried to, and he really got shut down by public housing residents. De Blasio has succeeded in doing so. We've got a couple developments in the works and much more on the way.
Damn.
It's interesting how, like, you talk about these constraints, and so the difference between a Bloomberg, not rhetorically, but actually in terms of policy, is we're going to do inclusionary zoning, we're going to give all these tax breaks for the development, but instead of 10% affordable housing within these luxury buildings, we'll give you 15 or 20%, right? That's sort of like the main difference is just how much they're willing to, like, slightly give up, to these giant developers.
Yeah, the thing is the same. De Blasio in some ways gets a little bit more from the developers. His program is like 30% affordable. There's all these quibbles about, is it affordable enough? And that's a real legit question. A majority of African Americans and Latinos in the city do not qualify for the new affordable housing that's being produced. So it's not affordable enough. There's still not enough of it. At 30%, even though that's more than Bloomberg was willing to do, it's still 30%. But then it's always paired with this luxury development, which has these market effects within the neighborhood that make these relatively affordable spaces no longer affordable.
So what's the role of philanthropy and liberal NGOs in all of this? Because in your book, you write, philanthropic and real estate capital blend to find profits in extreme poverty. And I think most people probably think of these kinds of organizations as being generally good. They represent the community and they're getting the best deal for their people that they possibly can. So what's the role of these kinds of organizations? And Yeah,
it's really complicated. This is part of what my dissertation is going to be about. So my next book is going to be about unions and nonprofit organizations within this real estate state. That line I think that you're quoting comes from when I'm talking about homelessness. And I was referencing a book by Craig Wilsey, which I think is called The Value of Homelessness or something like that, which is about rich people who make a living off of either shelter housing or back to work programs, programs that pay homeless people ridiculously little wages.
The Doe Fund.
The Doe Fund, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the most famous ones, DOE Fund. And a lot of the business improvement districts in the city got their start by hiring homeless people to do sub-minimum wage work. And so they're extracting value from these homeless people with very few options and paying them far less than they would pay a housed worker. And
just to make an analogy, too, there's rightfully a lot of pushback against private prisons at this moment in the country, even though they're spreading all over the place. There's a similar dynamic within, it sounds like, homelessness and housing, that these people are making massive profits off of a social ill.
Right. And, similarly with the prison issue, yes, there are private prisons. Yes, there are prisons who do sub-minimum wage labor, but most prisoners are doing no work at all. And so it's much more of a warehousing situation. In these social service nonprofit homeless shelters, some people are doing this sub-minimum wage work, and a lot of people are just getting trained over and over and over and over again in some of it is how to work, but a lot of it is this sort of like Christian ideology about work.
Cool.
Yeah.
Bring that Calvinism back.
Yeah, and you sort of like earn your right to your bed by going to these trainings where you learn about the morality of disciplined work.
Is Ben Shapiro running these programs? What the fuck? That's just astounding to me. I mean, I believe it, but God, this
and then
totally normal country, folks.
The saddest, someone named Gretchen Purser writes about this, is homeless workers who are doing day labor jobs evicting foreclosed homeowners.
Jesus Christ.
Oh,
which she calls it something like a lateral class war or something like that.
Wow.
Well, speaking of that, a lot of the Sturm and Drang around gentrification, again, not just in New York City, but all over the world, including places like Berlin, is pitting often one group of working class people or downwardly mobile middle class urban professionals
What are you looking at me
against
for?
one another. I'm not looking at you. Well, I was looking into your pretty eyes. That's all it was. I was just fawningly looking at you. But we're gonna play a short little video right now that was made by, I believe it was like an anarchist artist collective about gentrification in Berlin.
Fucking fast came this to be in the past, let's say 1.5 years. Suddenly, they were all here. All these fucking students, artists, layabouts. The complete mob called creative class. Always and permanently with these small suck beer club mate bottles in their hands. Suddenly the whole neighborhood was filled up to the back teeth with this folk, and suddenly all was changing. The rents were no longer cheap. The drug dealers left the Reuterplatz. Warehouses closed. Instead, we got open-minded and open-gendered galleries. Junk dealer became to dealer in antiques. And dirty dog shit was turned into peaceful baby buggies.
That's good, right?
More general, this phenomenon is called gentrification.
So, again, about the optics of this, it seems like so much of it is about, the role of artists and hipsters and gentrifiers. It's kind of this most visible aspect or agent of gentrification. They're referred to as the gentrifiers, as though they're
the ones making this happen.
Right, yeah. But that isn't the whole story, right? So bring us through this process where a neighborhood is turned from a disinvested one. Artists are brought in as kind of like the shock troops of that, and then the yuppies come, and then whole neighborhoods transform.
Yeah. What's with all this hipster hate? Do you think they deserve it, or what?
Does the creative class deserve all the hate with their club mate drinking?
I mean, anyone who uses the term creative class probably deserves it.
You heard that,
Fair
Richard,
enough.
Florida?
Yeah, because that's not a class in the Marxist sense of class, right?
No, I mean, Richard Florida really wants to be a Marxist right now, and he says he is one. But no, it's not a class. And it's also kind of messed up. Like, there's a lot of artists who are working class and who are people of color and who have lived in these cities and lived through periods of disinvestment, and they are completely excluded from this narrative of who the artist is. Yeah, I mean, you can make that argument, and that generally in my world gets coded as the consumption side argument of gentrification. It's about who moves in, and what their tastes are, what they look like, what they do aesthetically to the buildings. That stuff does matter. And I kind of deal with it very quickly in the book, but the argument I make is it's just like any other commodity. It has to have production and consumption in order to realize value. So the producers of gentrification are the investors, the banks that give the mortgages, the developers that build the buildings, the landlords that build out the properties and take your rents every month, the property managers. Those are the producers of gentrification. The consumers of gentrification is the new middle class, or the hipster, or the artist, whatever you want to call them, and it's different in different places. In some places it will be the pure yuppie. In some places it'll be the hipster who identifies as the cultural opposite of the yuppie, but both can fulfill that consumer of gentrification function. If we have production without consumption, then you have a failed project. They've put a bunch of money in, but nobody's buying it. If you have consumption without production, then you have unmet demand. There's a bunch of people who would want to gentrify some city, but there's nobody building housing for them right now, so they don't do it. Or they don't have the opportunity to do it themselves in the case of artists who turn lofts into art space and housing.
Yeah, like it's so depressing because I mean I'm someone who finds value in these kinds of art spaces and like DIY culture or whatever, but I think I mean I myself and a lot of my friends in these scenes are really conflicted about their role in all of this, right? Because on the one hand, we want spaces where we can afford to live and to do our thing and, you know, find a community or whatever. On the other hand, we know that we are part of a very malicious process called gentrification that will eventually result in displacing not only the people who were there before us, but also us ourselves,
Right.
provided that we don't actually have trust funds, although, you know, lots of people say that we do. And
Just to put a fine point on that, I've lived in the city for nearly 20 years at this point, and I think I've lived in over 20 apartments. You know, capital's been chasing me all around the city for so many years.
Right.
I feel you on
they're
that.
never going to get you.
They've gotten
They
me.
got him 20 times.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah. But like, yeah, I spent my entire career as a music journalist pretty much chronicling the downfall of beloved DIY and independent venues. So like the very first article that I ever wrote for the Columbia Spectator when I was in college, like God knows how many years ago. How fucking old am I? A long time. It was a long time ago, folks. More than 10 years ago. Was about the sale of North Six, which was an independent
remember that
venue
place.
in Williamsburg.
Yeah.
It was great. To the Bowery Group, which also owned the Bowery Ballroom and Mercury Lounge, and how they were actually the lesser of two evils because they could have been bought by Clear Channel, which owns like everything, to 285 Kent, Death by Audio. That one really fucked me up real good. And they were cannibalized by Vice, which is just like a perfect symbol of
The irony there is
everything
there's so many
that's
levels
happening
of irony on that. Yeah.
They
in
closed
this world.
Glasslands too, right?
Yeah. So, is there a way for artists to stand in solidarity with these longer time residents against the forces of capital? Like maybe this is already happening and I just don't know about it. Like what would this look like?
Right. It definitely has to happen. I think it's really important that artists not see themselves as special in this regard. That artists see themselves as people who need to live and work in the city just like everybody else and to fight alongside everybody else against gentrification. There's a little too much of the artist as special class who needs special protection, and that ends up dividing up the tenant movement and also giving the city the option of creating new solutions just for artists,
Right.
which then gives the developers the cultural cachet that they thrive on.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen it on both sides, and like obviously the people who were there first have more of a right to be angry. And, you know, I'm never going to tell someone they shouldn't feel negatively about something that's going to impact their lives. But I see like a lot of hatred directed at the most visible people, like the artists or whoever. And you miss the forest for the trees, which is like the people with the actual money and the actual power, not to mention the system itself. So like,
And when you talk about the system itself, when Jamie and I lived at our last apartment, which we did for many years, 2-3 years into us living at this relatively cheap apartment, all of a sudden the cops were just on the corner all the time. Like,
no,
oh,
that happened when we first moved in, babe.
fine, you tell the fucking story.
Oh my God. When we first moved in, it was like, yeah, it was a gentrifying neighborhood of Bushwick. And there were cops on the corner all the time. And I asked the cops, I was like, what are you doing here? And they're like, oh, people have been getting robbed. People have been getting robbed for their phones. And I was like, oh, okay, good to know. And then eventually the cops disappeared because I don't know why.
See, I could have set it up better.
All right.
What you talk about in your book is that the police are kind of the strong arm of gentrification, and that they go in to these transitioning neighborhoods, as they call them, and they make the early entrants to that, the artists and then later the yuppies, feel comfortable living next to people that have less than them and that are often a different color from them and that they feel afraid of. And that is an actual policy that the city and the state pursues, you know, to put police in these areas in order to make them safe for that gentrification.
Yeah, and they do that. You know, if we think of like stop and frisk and things like that, the neighborhoods that had the highest numbers and concentration of stop and frisks in New York City were the gentrifying neighborhoods that were in the process of transition. It was not so much the certainly the all white and wealthy neighborhoods, but it also wasn't the poorest and most segregated African American and Latino neighborhoods. It was the neighborhoods that were going through gentrification. And so it had that economic function of kind of clearing the social terrain for the consumer side of gentrification and at the demand of the producers of gentrification as well. You've also seen across the country police departments using rising property values as a metric for their work being successful. So they will report to the mayor or the city council, look how good a job we did, the property values are rising.
Right.
So
Which
they
was the
understand
intention
this
from the beginning.
That's right.
Right.
So let's get out of. I think we understand a bit more now about the hell world we live in when it comes to shelter in this late capitalist society that we live in. So let's
Not late enough.
Not late enough. We let's talk about how we make it later, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right. So the what is to be done question. Recently, Jamie wrote an article in The Guardian about this USA Today infographic. It was actually directly written by a public relations company working with an insurance company, life insurance company. And this infographic, it shamed this increasingly immiserated working class on its unnecessary expenses, lunch and personal grooming, right? I came up with a concept that it comes actually Marx talked about this thing called barracks communism, which was this very kind of austere, regimented conception of what post-capitalism would look like. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's fair to say that what the ruling class wants now is barracks capitalism, right? They want us living in these pods. That, you're not going to have Netflix anymore, as Jamie said in the article. Instead of Netflix and chill, it's going to be stare at the wall and drool, right? So this is really, it seems like the future that they want is to take away even like this conception of the American dream. So it seems like this nightmare is being reproduced. And I think Jamie had a question to this end on, what can be done and what's the future of this.
Yeah. So you write in your book that the housing crisis is a crisis of social reproduction, which means the conditions that the working class needs in order to reproduce itself, basically to keep on living and working, they're going away. And they first went away for the poor, but now it's even starting to happen to rather well-off workers. For instance, like Sean mentioned, there are these pods in the Bay Area where you can pay $1,400 a month to sleep in a fucking bunk bed.
$1,400?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's called. I think the place is called Logan's Run.
Yeah, and that's like the new normal for people with a college degree. Right. So what's going to happen if that process is allowed to continue unchecked? Is this one of those internal contradictions in capitalism that I'm always hearing about?
I do think it's an internal contradiction in capitalism, but I don't think it's one that is automatically going to be resolved. I think capital is quite comfortable leaving this to the state to fix, and the state is quite comfortable leaving it to us to suffer through. And so, if we think of those three sectors of like labor, which is all of us, and the state and capital, somebody's going to have to deal with these social reproduction questions. And in this late capitalist stage, it is just falling more and more on us. So, it's up to us then to overthrow this system also, not just come up with the pods to live in.
So Jamie had mentioned earlier, and you had spoken about these NGOs that claim to represent the community, whatever that means. And not all of them are bad, right? We have the Regional Plan Association, which is still out there and making some regional plans for the ruling class. And
Number 4 out last year.
Oh, great. Yeah, check out Volume 4. It's even better. I mean, Assassination, Part 4 of New York. I guess before we get to the more utopian shit, which is where we always like to go on the Antifada, although scientific and utopian, what can happen, in the medium term, even within a capitalist framework, for us to start taking some of this power back? You mentioned, various forms of direct action that have happened, like tenants' rights organizations and rent strikes and things of that sort. What do you think we can start to do right now to build institutions of working class power to try to fight back even under this late thing?
Right. So, I mean, it's important to recognize that if we are in this problem in part or in large part because of this hyper concentration of capital into urban real estate, that also means that urban real estate capital is pretty vulnerable. They've put too much into it. And if we strike at it, capitalist costs can be thrown into a certain kind of crisis. We have to be prepared for that crisis. It's not going to be fun, but it's an opportunity. And so we should think about how we can take advantage of the vulnerability of all this money that's been sunk into real estate. If there are mass rent strikes, if there is a strong rent control movement, if there are limits on new development in areas that exhibit strong rent gaps, if we can decommodify land first in small parts and moving up to larger scales, we can actually choke the bottleneck of investment that we've seen in our cities. So that means building up a tenant movement. That means politicizing rent. We each pay rent every month. More than 2 million people in New York City pay more than half of their income in rent. We've, I think, been successful in politicizing development. What gets built where? We need to be politicizing rent as well. What exactly is this money going toward? Is it going toward the maintenance of the building, which I need to live in so that I don't die? Or is it just going straight to the pockets of a landlord and investors that have put their money into this building? I think we need to look at what we have right now and how we can expand it. So in some places, that means we have limited rent control. We need universal rent control. In some places, it means introducing rent control for the first time. It means looking at prior working class victories around community land trusts. In New York, we have one, which is the most affordable part of the Lower East Side. That is an opportunity to expand. We know that it works in that one place. We need to put it into place in others. We have community land trusts in Minneapolis and Burlington and San Francisco and all these other places, but they're small. But the idea of completely decommodifying the land is a thing that we know how to do. We just need
Can
to do
you
a lot more.
define community land trust for the people that might not know what it is?
A community land trust is a form of decommodified land tenure where the ownership of the land and the ownership of the buildings is separated. So one group, some sort of nonprofit organization, owns the land. Another group, usually the residents or the users, own the buildings or the garden or whatever it is that's on top. And so they can't speculate the value of the land against the value of the building. And there's usually pretty strict limits placed on what you can do with it. So if it's housing, you can't sell it for more than you bought it for. And that keeps it not only perpetually affordable, but it takes away the opportunity to speculate. Doesn't matter what happens to the value of the land. It doesn't even matter what happens to the value of the building. You can't make money off of the thing. That takes away an avenue of wealth generation for a lot of people, but it creates permanently affordable urban space. And changes people's relationship to space. Your home doesn't have to be your bank account. Your home can actually be your home.
Right.
That's really great. I also want to plug the Universal Rent Control campaign that we're doing right now in New York City DSA in coalition with other community groups. We just had a canvassing day. What the fuck day is it today? Yesterday. And we're going to be having a lot more. The rent laws expire in June. So that's super fucking soon. And I think for the most part, people tend to respond much better when you go canvass them to talk about something like universal rent control than just simply asking them to vote for your candidate for office.
Right.
And not to throw, not to throw cold water at this, but I think there was a huge struggle in California. It was Prop 10, right? They were trying to pass a ordinance that just allowed municipalities to have rent control. Is that correct? And it failed recently, right?
Yeah, they have a state limitation on what their rent control laws can do. They were trying to get rid of that limitation. They did not succeed. There was a whole lot of scare tactics around, well, if we have rent control, then everyone's property values will go down. And there's a whole lot of single-family homeowners in California who got scared, even though they had no intention of being landlords themselves, that simply the presence of rent control would obliterate their primary and, in some cases, sole financial asset.
And this touches, I think, on when you said that it is a choke point in the capitalist economy, but we need to be prepared for pushback because even outside of, a land trust or, really strong tenant organizations, even if we were to, completely fund the refabrication, the rehabilitation, I should say, of, say, NYCHA, public housing in New York City and where else it exists in the country, which is sparse, right? We need to start building new public housing. But then this contradiction comes up, which you talk about a lot in the book, which is that as soon as you do that, you are directly interfering with the capitalist market in real estate, in housing. So even to try to propose, let's build 100,000 new units of public housing, which we've done in the past, right? But to do in the future, that's going to come up with immense opposition by capital and its, politicians, to be frank, right?
Right. I mean, we need to be building the power now. We need to be changing the consciousness of how people think about housing, how people think about public housing, not just as a thing perceived to be failing right now, but as a thing that is a completely viable alternative to private land. In the past, when we created large-scale public housing in the United States, it was done through a program that said, for every new public unit you create, you have to demolish a private unit. And the ideology behind that was, well, we don't want to be messing with the market. We want to be replacing rather than adding to. We don't want to fall into that again, where we end up just demolishing poor people's housing, then building public housing in its place, which some of those people can then move into, but most will never. We need a completely new model. But luckily, those models exist because public housing is actually pretty great in a lot of the rest of the world. It's just
Yeah. Jamie and I were in Copenhagen. This is a fun little story. We might have told it before, but fuck it. We'll tell it again. We were with Anders, right, who was actually in town
who
right
I
now.
just hung out with last night. My old roommate, Anders, where I used to live with him in a loft building. Dun, dun, dun. We'll get to that in the bonus.
Yeah, we'll get to that in the bonus.
But we were riding bikes around Copenhagen, which is a beautiful city, and he was a wonderful host. Shout out to Anders. But we biked past some nice, normal looking buildings, and he's like, those are the public housing projects. And we're like, oh, wow, they look just like all the other buildings. And he's like, yeah, they didn't want the people who live there to feel bad about themselves or isolated. And we were like, wow,
imagine that.
What a concept.
Instead of some Le Corbusier, towers in the park model where you're kind of almost like separating from the rest of the built environment these areas of fear, these zones of fear, it's integrated into the landscape in such a way that it doesn't create that kind of stigma, right?
Well, yeah, and not to be too New York-centric, but the first New York City public housing is First Houses in the Lower East Side, which, if I'm not mistaken, was taking over existing tenement properties and turning them into public housing. So again, you would never know that they were public housing as opposed to private housing. We could be doing a lot more of that.
Are you saying we could be expropriating buildings that exist right now? Are you saying, as you said in your book, that the state, local, and federal government has been doing that by bailing out banks for years, and that's a process we could actually think about doing ourselves if we had the political and social power to make it happen?
In a word, yes.
All right.
Oh, hell yeah. That's the mindset, folks.
What would that look like? Because you talked about how the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were taking up a lot of these bad mortgages, right? And in order to bail out the banks. But for a moment, for a hot second in the flows of capital and the government budget, the government owned those, right? For like a hot second. So we could have done something else with it, right?
Absolutely. We could have done something else with it. We could be doing it again. Also, I mean, basically the federal government purchased huge amounts of toxic assets, which meant that those mortgages belonged to the government, which meant that those properties were, in a sense, owned by the public. But they were then mostly like sold over to Blackstone, the largest private equity firm and world's largest landlord. Of course, that's what the capitalist state was going to do. But we can look at that and say, you see, that we already do this. We could be doing it for the complete opposite purpose.
Well, maybe if we have a democratic socialist for president, when the next crash happens, things will go a bit differently.
Perhaps.
It's going to take a lot, but yeah, it's a start. It's definitely a start. But I think that you were talking about re-envisioning our relationship to housing and renting. I mean, that's something that could be happening before a Bernie Sanders or AOC is president, right? So that we have not just ideologically, but also in terms of like our own socialist policies, we have those built on the ground so that we can propose that and push for that when the next crash comes, because this speculative bubble economy is prone to these busts.
It has to be that way, I think. It's not only that it can be that way, I think it has to be. We're not going to get this as a gift from President Sanders. It's going to be because people are doing it already, and having a different president will protect us a little bit more from the army.
Yeah,
that's the mindset. I was testing you and you passed, so good job.
You passed the reformism test.
So we always like to look ahead to the future here at the Antifada. So What are some measures that have been taken to decommodify housing under the framework of actually existing socialism in the world? And what are some possibilities when designing our ideal socialist future?
Before you answer that, can you talk about the Karl Marx Hof in Red Vienna?
Have you been there?
I know I've seen pictures, though. It looks awesome.
Yeah, I've never been there either. I mean,
you know about it, though, right?
I know about
Yeah.
it. It's an enormous public housing development built in
20s.
Yeah, that's right. All right, 1920s in Red Vienna. It's something like the longest public housing block. It's not the tallest, but it's the longest. And it's gorgeous. It's like a building that anyone would see and think, wow, this is amazing housing. I would love to live here. They're basically palaces for the people. And they were built extensively in Red Vienna under this framework of modern housing, that we're going to have housing that is luxurious but cheap and is going to have a lot of common features so that social reproduction tasks don't have to be done in isolation in your home in this gendered way. They can happen collectively as well. So we can have shared childcare spaces and shared kitchens and also the privacy of our own apartments.
Sounds good.
Sounds pretty good, right? They had pools too.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Pools in
hot
the
tubs.
20s?
Can we have hot tubs in ours?
I think we can make that
I
happen.
am the jacuzzi journalist.
You're also a hot tub socialist, so it's perfect. But yeah, so the Karl Marx Hof is an example all the way back from the 1920s, and that was even just municipal socialism, right?
Right. That was Vienna, not Austria.
Right, and New York City, as I think it was Kim Moody said, went from a welfare state to real estate.
Yep.
It was I think Josh Freeman called New York City the largest social democratic polity in the United States. So even done on that smaller scale, but even like if we look at Cuba or the USSR or Singapore, how do we kind of take these examples and make a larger utopian vision that builds off of them?
Right, and we should say that here in New York City, as in Philadelphia and some other places, unions collectively looked at that Red Vienna model and say, let's see what we can do here, and built up this network of union or worker-owned cooperatives.
Electchester
For the electricians. The garment workers produce the most of them in New York City. Now, they also built a lot of those by evicting non-union workers. And so that's, once again, we can't just reproduce that model. But the housing itself is pretty nice. Electchester was built on a golf course, so that was evicting rich people's
yes.
leisure.
Nice.
Expropriate the golf courses and build cooperative housing.
But
Boom.
it was obscenely segregated.
Oh,
and there were civil rights demonstrations outside there for a long time.
IBEW, do better.
Yes.
They're already doing better. Local 3, but yeah.
It seems like unions could do so much if they were just way more radical. I mean, I say just, like, that's not a huge ask, but like I think you were talking about in your talk a little bit the different ways that building trades unions could stand in solidarity with working class people in the places where they're building the buildings,
Well,
right?
but before I let him answer that, when I have to do picket duty every year for my union, so I need to go on at least one picket. And one year they bust us up to Albany to defend 421A.
No,
I
of
swear,
course they did.
yeah, you can't make this shit up. So to defend that's the inclusionary zoning law, right? That,
it's
tax breaks.
Tax breaks
Right.
for developers. That,
Yeah.
So they have to produce some affordable housing, but some of it is market rate housing that is rent controlled. So, like, you could have a $30,000 rent controlled unit in Wall Street.
Cool. Yeah, that's real sustainable.
Yeah,
but
our house, actually, our apartment is currently quote unquote rent stabilized. But
more
like
about that in the bonus.
They got the tax break, but I guess that's for the bonus.
It's fine.
The maximum legal rent is like way, way, way more than what they can currently get for it. So the stabilization does nothing for us. Yeah.
Yes.
But besides my little stupid anecdote there, I had a larger point, which is that folks, socialists, the utopians out there who want to see a post-capitalist society, often look to the point of production as where things happen. And of course, ultimately, a lot has to happen there. But then you mentioned the unions and what they've done in terms of social reproduction and building cooperative housing in places like New York City and elsewhere. I think, is it fair to say that in order for us to even push these things forward, the working class is going to need reinvigorated, powerful, radical, militant unions again to make this happen to begin with, to start to address this?
Yeah, I think it's like climate change. It's not going to happen without the labor movement. But I also like to think about labor a little bit more expansively and to think about social reproductive labor and cultural production labor and all that stuff that goes into making space, making urban neighborhoods, and all that stuff that creates value that capitalists then prey on. That's also labor. And so then if we think of the housing movement as a labor movement. Because we put all this labor into building up our neighborhoods. We then need tenant unions and other forms of organization to collectivize and rather than be individuals fighting on that front.
That's a really good way to think about it.
And the more we break the power of non-union contractors in New York City, the more goes into me and Jamie's pension fund. So, it's a win-win-win.
Oh, boy.
Although we do want to abolish pensions someday. Let's get utopian.
Right.
All right. So based on what we've seen under really existing socialism, which has some things, to recommend it, and also social democratic experiments, how can we imagine a long-term vision for decommodified, non-capitalist shelter and housing?
Right. I think everyone who can should go to Cuba, go to Havana, and see what it's like in a place where basically all housing is public housing. And that's also an environment where it's not public housing in the U.S. model where we tore out the neighborhood and we built up these towers. It is the old built environment taken over by the revolutionary government.
I've seen the pictures. It's fucking beautiful, right?
It's beautiful, and parts of it are falling apart, and parts of it are a little bit nicer, and there's a few kind of super blocks of Soviet-style housing out by the beach, but most of the city of Havana is the city of Havana as it was built. And if you then think about what would New York City look like under those conditions? We don't have to imagine the total demolition of our neighborhoods, including those rich, nice places where we can't afford to live.
Right.
We think of the expropriation of them and what we would do with Fifth Avenue, for example.
Well,
What wouldn't we do with it?
before you go on, I'd like to point to your excellent article in The Guardian talking shit on the Hudson Yards development and say that of all the places in New York City that might be recuperated for the working class, we might have to get rid of Hudson Yards.
Yeah.
It's a disgusting, oh, God.
Yeah, Mike
Glass
Davis
and steel.
wrote an article in Jacobin in the first issue that I was ever in, which was the city's issue in 2014. It was called B-52 Urbanism.
What?
And he said that he used to have an exercise in one of his design studios where we would ask his students, if you could blow up any building in this city, killing no one, you have to decide which one it was to get them to think in a kind of angry, destructive kind of way. And so it
How
sounds
pure
like
is your hate style?
yeah, your answer is Hudson Yards.
It sure
perhaps.
is, yes.
Oh, yeah.
In no small thanks to you, because you were the one that wrote the
That
article.
thing,
talking
it
about
really
how-
does. I can't not see a fast food chicken when I look at it now.
You don't want to go to see theater in a glorified handbag on wheels. That's literally what the shed.
Oh my
the
God.
shed
Or,
looks like.
I don't want to go do business in a fucking maggot infested kebab or whatever they compared it to.
We'll put links in the show notes so people know what we're
Yeah.
talking about to Sam's article. But sorry, go on. I just want to talk shit on that disgusting development.
It's horrible. and think of the opportunity too, right? I mean, that was the largest buildable space in Manhattan, and that's what we did with it. Anyway, just talking about Havana because it really opened my eyes up to the possibilities. Not that I didn't know it existed before, not that it's perfect, because it's not, but to not think about a completely new city, but the city you actually have right now, but taken over through revolutionary action, is something that everyone who can should experience.
So not tearing down, but reappropriating. And
I happen to like my city.
Yeah.
it's a
I
great
hate the fucking landlords, but I like the city.
And I think people feel the same way about Austin or Cincinnati or Portland or Berlin or London, right?
Yeah.
It's the social relations that are corrupt and rotten, not necessarily the built environment itself.
Right. And maybe, so this is another thing. If we had socialized land, if we had public sovereignty over planning, if we had regional planning rather than every municipality for itself, we might get to the point where we could have an actual thought about what kind of city we want to live in. Right now, it's really hard because every time we think about changing it, we think about who's going to get rich off of that and who's going to get displaced by that. I would love to think about what density level would actually be nice. What density level would be good for the environment?
Right.
What public transit do we need? But when we're stuck in this system where the landlords expropriate all the value we create, anytime we expand the subways, we create huge amounts of value for a whole bunch of people, which is translated into rising rents, which means displacement.
Right.
We extended the 7 line out to Hudson Yards, further into Manhattan. We should have sent it out deeper into Flushing. Sorry, non-New Yorkers. But
Or to New Jersey, as they said to
or to New
Secaucus.
Jersey.
Even. Yeah.
Right. But we didn't do any of those things, and if we had, we would have had to deal with the consequences of extraordinarily rising land values.
Let me add a utopian sheen to what you've already said, which I think is very inspiring. Think about how much. Go down to go to Midtown Manhattan or go down to Wall Street and look up at those buildings, most of which are old. No, some of which are old, but most of them are pretty beautiful and nice and usable, right? And think about the amount of space turned over under capitalism to moving pieces of paper around, to moving money around, right? Yeah. In terms of like lacking in built infrastructure, imagine if we had a planned society or a communist society, a society without money, how much fewer how much less space would be used up in like people sitting around in offices all the time, or people like things like I don't know, nail salons or whatever the case may be, things that people can do collectively in terms of social reproduction. Like a lot of those office buildings that exist right now could be turned over to public use for things that are actually valuable, not like TPS reports.
Right. And so it's space and it's also time.
Right.
Huge amounts of space are dedicated to this worthless finance industry, and huge amounts of time are dedicated to bullshit jobs and other things that are not done for any collective purpose. And so we would have a lot more space, we'd have a lot more time. It's hard to even imagine what we would do with Wall Street without Wall Street.
And when I talk shit on nail salons, I was talking about them as capitalist enterprises. I think entire buildings in Manhattan will be turned over for people to go and do their nails together, cooperatively. Okay, that's what I meant.
You could take turns.
Yeah, it'd be great.
You do my nails, I'll do yours.
Exactly, not wage labor, just like collective nail.
Maybe
filing.
we can make a little massage circle or something. Rub each other's shoulders.
A cuddle puddle, even perhaps / nail collective.
Yeah, because like there's nail salons where they're like rub your shoulders for you while your nails are drying, but who's going to rub their shoulders?
And what about the places you go where you dip your feet in the water and the fish eat off the dead skin? That should be collectivized too.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't have to pay for that shit. That should be a human right.
But like the most important thing that I think we need to do with a lot of this soon to be empty, God willing, public space is bring back the public bathhouses. They play a big role in the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson that we talked about, where everyone just goes and like chills the fuck out in the water, and sometimes they have some sexy times there.
Folks, what if Plato's Retreat but communist?
Like it would be so good.
And the club scene?
Like,
oh my God.
Like consent is very
imagine?
important. Obviously, you don't have to have public sex in the bathhouse if you don't want to. But if you do, it's there for you and no one will judge you.
And it's great. And everybody will have better collective sex. It won't be like weird, like Manafort, Roger Stone, poly stuff. It'll be like...
Absolutely not.
Yeah, Roger Stone will not play any part in our revolution.
No, certainly not. I mean, there'd also be more space to be by yourself. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are living in very crowded conditions under capitalism. I mean, that's been the case in the Industrial Revolution. It's the case right now.
Oh, yeah. It's not even just the poor anymore. It's like fucking 5 college graduates sharing a 2-bedroom apartment or whatever.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, too, when Jamie was talking about the pods and we were discussing it, my mind went back to that famous, one of the famous Jacob Riis photographs of people living in tenement conditions. It was like 8 people in a room, and you could see the cots, and people were sleeping in shifts.
Shift bed
this
housing.
This is the future this is the barracks capitalism that they want. This is the present, right?
It's
They
here.
want that for everybody.
Yeah.
And so space, personal space, is super important as well. Not to mention all the things that our particular mode of production does to nature and wildlife.
Right.
I can imagine that in a rational society, not just the cities, but also the countrysides too, would be freed up for all sorts of social activity that we don't have the time to do right now or even have the access.
Yeah. All of the things that people scared you about during the Cold War that communism was going to do, capitalism has already done and is in the process of intensifying.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you don't have freedom to decide where you live or what you do with your time. Like, spoiler alert, that's already here. Everyone lives in depressing buildings.
You'll get in your you'll go in your pod and shut up, okay? You give what the speculators at Blackstone will
Oh
allow
no,
you.
people are gonna wait in hour-long bread lines. Bitch, you wait an hour for brunch all the time, and then you have to pay for it at the end. So like I said in my tweet the other day that a lot of people seem to like, socialized brunch will reduce wait times and expand access.
B4A, brunch for all.